I didn't cry when my daughter-in-law handed me the suitcase. I didn't argue when my son told me it was the best decision for everyone. I just stood in my own kitchen. The kitchen where I'd made 30 years of Thanksgiving dinners, where I'd taught my grandchildren to roll pie crust, and I nodded. I let them think I agreed. My name is Dorothy. I'm 71 years old. I was a school librarian for 34 years in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. I know how stories work. I know that the most dangerous moment in any story isn't when the villain appears, it's when the hero goes quiet. That Tuesday morning in March, I went very quiet. My son Richard had been building toward this for months. Little comments at Sunday dinners. "Mom, this house is too big for one person." Concerned looks exchanged with his wife Carol when they thought I wasn't watching. A pamphlet left on my coffee table once. Meadow Creek Senior Living, where comfort meets care, as if it had fallen there by accident. I picked it up, read it cover to cover, and set it back down in the exact same spot. I said nothing. I had learned, by then, that silence was a kind of armor. My husband, Gerald, passed 4 years before all of this. 38 years we were married. He was a civil engineer who cried at every single one of our daughter's school recitals and kept a jar of peppermint candies on his desk that he gave to every child who visited the house. When he died, something structural went out of my life. Not just grief, though there was plenty of that, but a kind of load-bearing wall that I hadn't known was holding everything up. Richard stepped in. At first it felt like love. He called every day. He came by on weekends to mow the lawn and check the gutters. He took me to my cardiologist appointments and sat in the waiting room with his laptop, always there when I came back out. I was grateful. I told him so. What I didn't understand, not yet, was that he was making an inventory. The house was paid off. Gerald and I had bought it in 1987 for $82,000. Richard told me, very casually, over pot roast one Sunday, that the neighborhood had really appreciated. He pulled out his phone and showed me a real estate app. The number on the screen was $460,000. He said it with a kind of reverence that made my stomach turn, though I smiled and said, "Goodness." 6 months later, he sat me down and told me he'd spoken to an attorney. He said the words, "power of attorney," the way doctors say, minor procedure. Routine. Nothing to worry about. Just a formality, really, so that if something ever happened to me, he could handle my affairs without any complications. He had the paperwork already printed. Carol sat beside him with her hands folded in her lap. I was a librarian for 34 years. I know what fine print looks like. But I signed it. I want you to understand why. Because he was my son. Because I had held him as a baby and watched him learn to walk across that same kitchen floor. And because somewhere beneath all the careful words and printed documents, I still believed that love was the thing underneath all of it. I signed it because I was afraid that if I didn't, I would lose him entirely. And at 71, having already lost Gerald, the thought of losing Richard too felt unsurvivable. I signed it on a Wednesday. By the following Monday, I understood what I had done. Richard called that morning and told me he'd arranged for me to try out Meadow Creek. Just for 30 days. A trial stay, he said, to see if I liked it. He used the word opportunity 3 times in 4 sentences. Carol had already packed a bag for me, he said. They would be by at noon. I sat in Gerald's armchair by the window and looked out at the backyard. The tulip tree we planted the year our daughter Melissa was born was just starting to bud. I had a doctor's appointment the following Thursday. I had a book club meeting the Friday after that. I had a life, small and ordinary and entirely mine. They arrived at noon exactly. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I picked up the suitcase Carol had packed, and I walked to Richard's car and I got in. I watched my house disappear in the passenger side mirror, and I thought, not yet. Not like this. Meadow Creek was clean. I want to be fair about that. The floors were polished, and the staff smiled, and there were fresh flowers at the front desk every Monday. My room had a window that faced a small garden where two squirrels conducted what seemed like an ongoing territorial dispute. Under other circumstances, I might have liked it. But my phone had been left at home. Richard said it was because I always forgot to charge it and he worried I'd lose it. He said he'd bring it soon. He did not bring it. I was not locked in, technically. The doors were not barred, but I was 71 years old without a car, without a phone, in a facility 22 miles from my home, and my son had power of attorney. Technically is a word that does a lot of heavy lifting when someone wants to feel better about what they've done. On my third day there, I borrowed a pen from a woman named Evelyn who lived 2 doors down and wrote my daughter's phone number on the inside of my wrist in ballpoint ink, the way I used to write grocery lists in college when I couldn't find paper. Melissa lived in Portland. She and Richard had not been close since a disagreement at Gerald's funeral about the estate, a disagreement Richard had, I later learned, engineered deliberately. He had told her things about me that were not true. She believed some of them. Our relationship had been careful and cautious for 4 years. 2 people walking across ice they weren't sure would hold. I needed to reach her. But first, I needed a phone. There was a common room with a television that ran cable news on a loop. There was a small library. I had opinions about the selection, but that is neither here nor there. And there was a nurse's station where a young woman named Patricia worked the morning shift. Patricia was 26 years old, studying for her RN boards at night, and she had a laugh that seemed to surprise even her, like it escaped before she could stop it. I started stopping by the nurse's station in the mornings, not asking for anything, just talking. About her studies, about the boards, about a particular pharmacology concept she mentioned struggling with that I had, by coincidence, read about in depth because Gerald had been on 3 of the medications in question. She was surprised that I knew. I was a librarian, I told her. I know how to find things. By the end of my first week, Patricia let me use the desk phone when the station was quiet. The first time I called Melissa, she answered on the 3rd ring, and when I said her name, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "Mom, where are you calling from? Richard told me you'd checked in voluntarily." I told her everything. I spoke quietly and quickly, and I told her about the power of attorney and the packed suitcase and the 22 miles and the phone that had been left at home. I told her I needed her to find me a lawyer. Not a favor, not a visit. A lawyer. An elder law attorney. She was quiet again for longer this time. Then she said, "I'll find someone today." I thanked her and hung up and walked back down the hall to my room where the squirrels were still arguing over territory in the garden. I sat down on the edge of my bed and I let myself feel, for exactly 3 minutes, how frightened I was. I cried quietly into a tissue, and then I washed my face and put the tissue at the bottom of the trash can and I went to dinner. 12 days later, an attorney named Howard Kaplan called Meadow Creek and asked to speak with me. He specialized in elder law. He had been doing it for 27 years. Melissa had found him through a nonprofit organization she'd located online. He had a calm, deliberate voice that reminded me of Gerald, and he told me 4 things. He told me that the power of attorney Richard held was durable, meaning it had taken effect upon signing, but that it could be challenged if I could demonstrate that I had signed under undue influence. He told me that my capacity was clearly intact. He said this plainly, not as a compliment, but as a legal fact, and that this worked in my favor. He told me that I had rights as a resident of the facility, and that I could not be held against my will. And he told me that the house had not yet been listed, but that he had reason to believe Richard had contacted at least 2 real estate agents in the last 3 weeks. I asked him what I needed to do. He told me. Over the following 18 days, I did it. I wrote them revocation of the power of attorney by hand on paper Patricia quietly provided, and Howard filed it from his office in Cleveland. I had a psychological evaluation conducted by a Dr. Howard, arranged, who came to Meadow Creek and spoke with me for 90 minutes. She was thorough and entirely unmoved by the fact that I was a woman of 71 in a facility, which I appreciated. She wrote a report stating that I was fully competent to manage my own affairs. Richard called twice during this period. I took both calls from the desk phone at the nurse's station, with Patricia finding quiet reasons to remain nearby. He asked if I was feeling better. He asked if I'd thought more about the house. He mentioned, in a tone of practiced casualness, that he'd met with someone who could help simplify the property situation. I told him I was sleeping well and that the food was adequate. I asked after the grandchildren. I said nothing else. I want to describe the morning the documents were finalized. Howard called me at 9:14. I had been awake since 5, sitting by the window watching the light change over the garden. He told me the revocation had been formally recorded. He told me the psychological evaluation had been filed. He told me that I was Dorothy Elizabeth Callahan of 4417 Rentham Drive, Columbus, Ohio, and that I had full, unencumbered legal authority over every aspect of my own life. I thanked him. I hung up. I looked out at the garden for a long time. Then I called Melissa. She came the next morning in a rental car from the airport. She walked into the common room wearing her winter coat and looking like she hadn't slept on the plane, and when she saw me, she crossed the room quickly and held on to me for a long time without saying anything. I felt the 4 years of careful distance go out of her like air. I thought about Richard telling her things about me that were true, and I held her tighter. We didn't speak about that yet. We had time. I was discharged from Meadow Creek that afternoon. I want to be precise. I was not released. I discharged myself. I signed the paperwork. I thanked Patricia, who hugged me and then pretended she hadn't because she was on duty. And I walked out through the front doors in the afternoon light and got into Melissa's rental car. On the way home, Melissa told me what she'd learned about the house. Richard had been in serious financial trouble for almost 2 years, a business venture that had gone badly, debts that he had managed to hide from everyone, including, apparently, Carol. The plan, as best Howard could determine, had been to use the power of attorney to sell the house, place me in Meadow Creek on a long-term basis, funded by the proceeds, and use the remainder to stabilize his finances. He had believed I would be compliant. He had believed, I think, that the woman who had signed those documents at the kitchen table was someone who could be managed. He had known me for 45 years and still had the wrong idea about who I was. I came home to my house on Rentham Drive on a Tuesday afternoon in late April. The tulip tree that Melissa and I had planted the year she was born was in full bloom now. The branches thick with pale pink flowers against a sky that was doing its best. I stood in the driveway for a moment before going in. I had been gone 41 days. The house was exactly as I had left it. Richard had a key, but he had not touched anything. Perhaps because Howard's filing had moved quickly. Perhaps because some part of him hadn't been able to. I walked through every room. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I sat in Gerald's armchair and looked out at the backyard. I cried again, but differently this time. In the weeks that followed, I made changes. I updated my will with Howard's assistance, and I want to be straightforward about what that means. Richard was removed. Not in anger exactly. Anger had burned off by then and left something cleaner behind. But because trust is a door that, once taken off its hinges, cannot simply be rehung. What I felt was something closer to grief. Grief for the son I had believed he was. Grief for the particular kind of loneliness that arrives when you realize that someone has been cataloging your vulnerabilities instead of loving you. I set up a separate account at a different bank. Howard helped me understand exactly what documents I should and should not sign. I put a letter in a sealed envelope in my fireproof box, addressed to Melissa, explaining everything, where all the accounts were, who the attorneys were, what my wishes were in every circumstance. I told her she didn't need to read it yet, She said she hoped she never had to. I said, I hope so too. Richard called once, about 6 weeks after I came home. He had found out about the revocation from Howard's office. His voice on the phone was strange. Not angry the way I had expected, but something more uncertain. Like a person standing on ground that has suddenly shifted underfoot. He said he'd only been trying to help. He said he'd been worried about me. He said he'd been worried about me. He said, near the end, that he hoped we could talk. I told him I was glad he'd called. I told him I was well. I told him the tulip tree was beautiful this year. And then I told him that I needed some time and that I would reach out when I was ready and that he should not come to the house without calling first. He said, okay. He sounded like a child. I remembered, for a moment, that he was my child. It didn't change what I'd decided, but I held it. I have not called him yet. Maybe I will. That part of the story isn't finished. What I know is this. I am 71 years old. And I live in the house I have lived in for 34 years. And the tulip tree is blooming again in my backyard. I have a good attorney, a daughter who answers on the third ring, and a neighbor named Evelyn who comes for coffee on Thursday mornings and cheats at cards in a way that I find completely charming. I have a library card, a book club, and a cardiologist who has told me my heart is, and I quote, structurally solid. I am not waiting to be rescued. I was never waiting to be rescued. People ask me sometimes. Since all of this came to light, since Melissa told her own friends, since this story started to travel the way true stories do, they ask me what I would tell other women in my situation. Women who have signed things they shouldn't have. Women who are sitting in a room 22 miles from their lives wondering if anyone is going to come. I tell them the same thing I told myself in that room at Meadow Creek, sitting on the edge of my bed with the tissue in my hand. 3 minutes. You get 3 minutes to feel how frightened you are. Then you wash your face. Then you find someone with a pen. The squirrels, by the way, are still at it. I watch them from the kitchen window now. From my own kitchen in my own house. I made coffee this morning in Gerald's old percolator. The one Richard had suggested I donate because nobody uses those anymore. And I watched those 2 ridiculous squirrels chase each other across the fence, and I laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen. In the way that you can only really laugh when you are finally, completely, entirely free.